I was inside the Chernobyl control room. I remember the control room before I remember the explosion. People always imagine chaos. Alarms screaming, men shouting, lights flashing red like something out of a film. But that is not how it began. It began quietly. Too quietly. With the low, constant hum of machinery that had been my companion for years. A sound so familiar it felt like breathing. I was an engineer at Reactor No. 4. Not a hero. Not a villain. Just a man who trusted numbers more than people. That night, April 26, 1986, I had been awake for nearly 20 hours. The air in the control room was stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Coffee cups sat untouched, gone cold. Paper logs were scattered across consoles, smudged with fingerprints and graphite. We were preparing for a safety test, one that had been delayed, rushed, and poorly understood by almost everyone in that room, including me. I can admit that now. I could not admit it then. The test was supposed to prove that the reactor could sustain cooling water flow during a power loss. It was not meant to be dangerous. That is what we were told. That is what we told ourselves. But reactors do not care what you tell yourself. I watched the power levels drop lower than they should have. Too low. Someone made a mistake. Maybe me, maybe someone else. It hardly matters now. In response, control rods were withdrawn to compensate. Another mistake. Then another. We were no longer operating the reactor. We were chasing it. There is a moment, just before disaster, when everything still seems salvageable. That is the most dangerous moment of all. When the test began, I felt it before I saw it. A vibration beneath my feet. Subtle wrong. Like standing on ice that has begun to crack. The instruments started behaving strangely. Power surged where it should not have. Numbers climbed faster than the human eye could track. Someone called out readings that made no sense. Someone else laughed nervously as if disbelief could undo physics. Then someone shouted to press the emergency shutdown button. I remember the hand reaching for it. I remember thinking, this will end it. This will save us. I was wrong. When the control rods entered the reactor, they did not calm it. They enraged it. There was a sound, not an explosion, not yet, but a deep, violent thud, like the earth itself had been struck from below. The floor jumped. Panels rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling. And then the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Faces looked different under that light. Older, frightened, stripped of authority. The hum was gone. In its place was silence. A silence so complete it hurt my ears. Someone whispered, "The reactor is destroyed." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that reactors do not simply explode. That they cannot. But even as the words formed in my mind, I knew the truth. A second shockwave hit. Stronger. The walls groaned. Something massive collapsed somewhere above us. Through a broken window at the far end of the corridor, I saw a blue light rising into the night sky. It was beautiful. That is the part that haunts me the most. We did not know what that light was. Ionized air. Radiation tearing electrons apart. Death made visible. We stood there, staring at it like children watching fireworks. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time lost its meaning. Phones rang without answers. Orders came from above, from men who were not there, who could not see what we saw. They told us the reactor was intact. They told us to pump water. They told us to go and look. I volunteered. I do not know why. Duty. Pride. Denial. Maybe I needed to see it myself to believe it. The corridors outside the control room were dark, lit only by emergency lamps. Pieces of ceiling lay scattered across the floor. Steam filled the air, carrying a metallic taste that clung to the back of my throat. My skin prickled as if I had walked into a room charged with static electricity. The closer I got, the worse it felt. At the reactor hall entrance, there was no door anymore. Just twisted metal and concrete dust. I looked inside. The reactor was gone. Not damaged. Not cracked. Gone. Where thousands of tons of graphite and uranium had once been, there was now an open wound. Glowing fragments lay scattered like embers from a dying fire. The roof had been torn away, exposing the core to the sky. I remember thinking something very calmly, very clearly. This should not be possible. I stumbled back, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes had already processed. Someone asked me what I saw. I told them the reactor was intact. I lied. I lied because if I told the truth, everything would change. Evacuation. Panic. Responsibility. Blame. And deep down I still hoped I was wrong. By morning men were vomiting. Skin reddened. Eyes burned. Firefighters arrived without protection. climbing onto the reactor debris to put out flames that should not have existed. I watched them from the control room window. I knew they were dying. By the end of the day, I knew I was dying too. Radiation sickness does not feel dramatic at first. Feels like exhaustion. Like the flu. Like regret settling into your bones. The body understands long before the mind does. In the hospital, my hair began to fall out in clumps. Blisters formed where there had been no burns. Doctors avoided my eyes. They did not need to say anything. At night, I dreamed of the control room. The hum returning. The numbers behaving themselves. The test ending normally. I always woke up before the button was pressed. Before the truth. I survived longer than many. Weeks. Long enough to understand what had happened. Long enough to hear the official statements. The denials. The revisions. The lies layered over lies until the truth was buried beneath language. They called it an accident. They called it unforeseeable. They never called it human. I replayed that night over and over, not searching for the moment it went wrong, but for the moment it could have gone right. I never found it. Now, years later, people visit Chernobyl like a monument. They take photographs. They talk about history. About lessons learned. They do not hear the control room. They do not hear the silence after the hum stops. I do. I was there. I watched the reactor die. And I listened as the world changed forever, without realizing it had already begun. I did not leave the plant on my own feet. That is something people rarely understand. They imagine us walking away, realizing our mistake, looking back at the smoke rising from the reactor like a moral horizon. That did not happen. We were carried, dragged, loaded into vehicles by men who did not yet know they were already exposed. The ride to the hospital felt unreal. The streets of Pripyat were still quiet. It was early morning. Birds were singing. People were opening windows, shaking rugs, starting their day as if the world had not just cracked open. I wanted to scream at them to go back inside. But my mouth would not cooperate. By the time we arrived, my hands were trembling uncontrollably. Not from fear. From something deeper. Something cellular. My body had begun to understand what my mind was still resisting. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. Beds were placed too close together. Doctors moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones. They asked where I had been. How long? What I had seen. I lied again. I said I was in the control room the entire time. I said I never approached the reactor hall. I said I was fine. The Geiger counter betrayed me immediately. Its sound was sharp, insistent, accusatory. A nurse looked at the reading, then at me, then back at the reading again. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes closed. They isolated us in a separate wing. Curtains drawn. Windows shut. No visitors. We were told it was precautionary. That everything was under control. I had heard that phrase before. Within hours, the nausea began. Not gentle. Not gradual. It came in violent waves that left me gasping, empty, humiliated. My skin felt tight as if it no longer belonged to me. When I touched my face, my fingers left red marks that lingered far too long. Men around me began to deteriorate rapidly. One engineer lost consciousness and never regained it. Another began bleeding from his gums, his nose, his ears. A firefighter, young, barely more than a boy, kept asking when he could go home. He had promised his wife he would be back by breakfast. By evening, his skin had turned the color of raw meat. The doctors stopped pretending. They spoke to each other in low voices, using terms that were never meant for patients to hear. Acute radiation syndrome. Dose estimates. Bone marrow failure. Irreversible damage. I was not afraid of dying. I was afraid of understanding. Lying in that bed, staring at a ceiling stained with old watermarks, I replayed the control room again and again. Every dial. Every number. Every command. I searched for a villain. A single decision. A moment I could isolate and destroy. But the truth was far worse. It was all of us. Not because we were evil, but because we were obedient. Because we trusted procedures written by people who never stood where we stood. Because we believed that something built by human hands could be fully controlled by human minds. On the second day, my hair began to fall out. It came out easily, almost politely, as if my body were apologizing. I gathered the strands in my hand and stared at them for a long time, trying to feel something profound. I felt nothing. That frightened me more than the pain. The city was evacuated that afternoon. We heard it on the radio. Buses lining the streets. Loudspeakers telling residents to pack for 3 days. 3 days, they said. I laughed. The laughter turned into coughing. The coughing turned into blood. At night, I dreamed of graphite blocks. of glowing fragments drifting through the air like snow, of the blue light climbing endlessly into the sky. I woke each time convinced that I was still in the control room. On the third day, a man from Moscow arrived. He wore a clean suit, no badge, no visible insignia. He asked to speak with me alone. The doctors hesitated, then stepped aside. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might contaminate him. "You were present at the test," he said. "Yes. You understand the importance of discretion." I almost laughed again. He told me what the official report would say. A sudden power surge. Operator error. A chain of unfortunate coincidences. He told me what would not be included. Design flaws. Known risks. Ignored warnings. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and his voice softened. "You will not be blamed," he said. "History will move on." I asked him if the men around me would move on too. He did not answer. After he left, I understood something with absolute clarity. The reactor had exploded once. But it would continue exploding for decades. In documents. In silence. In the slow poisoning of land and memory. My condition stabilized briefly. Long enough for hope to become cruel. Long enough for me to believe I might survive. Then the fevers returned. My skin began to peel in sheets. Simple movements became unbearable. Even breathing felt like effort I could not afford. A doctor I recognized, someone I had worked with years earlier, stood at the foot of my bed one evening. He did not speak. He did not need to. I asked him one final question. Did anyone believe me? He hesitated. Then he shook his head. That night, as my body failed piece by piece, I stopped thinking about blame. About politics. About truth. I thought about the hum. The sound of the reactor when it was alive. Steady. Predictable. Almost comforting. And I realized something then, something I had avoided since the moment I pressed my eyes to that broken doorway. We had not just lost control of the reactor. We had lost the right to pretend we ever truly had it. They did not call it an investigation at first. They called it a review. That word matters. A review implies improvement, reflection, a desire to understand. What arrived instead was a procession of men with notebooks who already knew what they intended to write. By the time they allowed me to leave the hospital, I was no longer the same person who had entered it. I walked slowly. My joints burned. My reflection startled me, gaunt, hollow-eyed, older by decades. But I was alive, and that made me useful. They transferred me to Moscow under the guise of continued treatment. A special clinic. Restricted access. Guards in the hallway who never spoke to me unless necessary. Every morning someone asked me the same questions. What did you see? What did you hear? Who gave the order? At first I answered carefully. I described the test. The power drop. The emergency shutdown. I used technical language, precise phrasing. I avoided conclusions. They nodded, took notes, and asked again the next day. Then the questions changed. When did you notice operator confusion? Who failed to follow protocol? Why did you not stop the test? I began to understand my role. I was not there to explain what happened. I was there to make it simple. They wanted a story that could be told in a paragraph. One that ended cleanly. One that blamed individuals, not systems. One afternoon, they placed a transcript in front of me. It was my testimony. Or rather, a version of it. Sentences I did not remember saying. Emphases I did not agree with. Omissions so large they felt intentional. I pointed this out. The man across from me adjusted his glasses and smiled politely. You are misremembering, he said. That was the moment something inside me broke permanently. They released the report weeks later. I read it in a quiet room alone with my hands shaking. According to the document, the disaster had been caused by reckless operators who violated safety procedures. Design flaws were mentioned only briefly, framed as theoretical, not decisive. I was cited as a cooperating expert. My name was clean. Too clean. When I returned to what remained of my life, people treated me differently. Some with pity. Others with suspicion. A few with admiration I did not deserve. I was invited to conferences. Asked to speak about lessons learned. I declined every time. At night I could not sleep. When I did, the dreams had changed. No more explosions. No more blue light. Just paperwork. Forms being stamped. Statements being filed. Words covering reality like layers of paint. I began to collect articles. Foreign reports. Whispers from colleagues who had also survived. Engineers who knew the truth but understood the cost of saying it aloud. We spoke carefully. In metaphors. In pauses. Everyone was afraid of the same thing. Not prison. Erasure. Years passed. The Soviet Union began to fracture. Chernobyl faded from headlines but not from soil. I watched from a distance as liquidators were praised, then forgotten. As the sarcophagus cracked and was repaired again. History was being sealed over just like the reactor. Then one winter afternoon I received a letter. No return address. No signature. Inside was a copy of an internal memo I had never seen before. Dated years prior to the accident. It warned explicitly about the reactor's instability at low power. About the very conditions we had created during the test. In the margin was a handwritten note. This was known. I sat for a long time holding that paper, feeling the familiar burning in my chest. Not from radiation this time, but from clarity. The accident had not been unforeseen. It had been scheduled. I realized then why I had survived when so many others had not. I was not spared by chance. I was spared by necessity. Someone had needed a witness. Someone had needed a man who could say years later, I was there, and still be breathing. That knowledge was heavier than any dose I had received. I burned the letter that night. Watched the paper curl and blacken. Not out of fear, but because I finally understood the rules of the world I lived in. Truth was not something you revealed. It was something you carried. And carrying it came at a cost. As I stood by the window watching snow fall onto a city that no longer remembered the names of the dead, I accepted something I had resisted since that night in the control room. The reactor did not only melt down because of physics. It melted down because silence was easier than accountability. And silence, once chosen, becomes impossible to escape. I'm an old man now. My hands shake when I write. My breath is shallow. The doctors say it is my heart, but I know better. My heart did not fail me. It simply grew tired of carrying what my mouth never said. Chernobyl still follows me. Not in dreams anymore. In quieter ways. In how I hesitate before answering questions. In how I listen more than I speak. In how silence feels heavier than sound. People sometimes ask me if I regret that night. It is a simple question. Too simple. Regret implies choice. That night, in the control room, we believed we were professionals performing a task assigned to us. We trusted procedures. We trusted authority. We trusted that someone, somewhere above us, understood the machine better than we did. That trust was the true failure. Years after the accident, I was invited, unofficially, to return to the exclusion zone. No cameras. No speeches. Just a quiet visit. I agreed. The road to the plant was empty. Nature had reclaimed everything. Trees growing through asphalt. Animals roaming freely where children once played. It was beautiful in a way that felt deeply wrong. The reactor stood in the distance, sealed beneath layers of steel and concrete. A tomb pretending to be a solution. I stood there for a long time. I tried to feel closure. There was none. I thought about the men who never left that building. The firefighters who climbed into something they could not see. The engineers who trusted me when I said the reactor was intact. I thought about the moment I lied. Not the first lie. Not the official ones. The quiet, personal lie. The one where I chose certainty over truth. That lie lived longer than radiation. I realized then that history does not punish lies. It absorbs them, smooths them out, turns them into acceptable narratives. What remains are witnesses. And witnesses are inconvenient. I was interviewed once, years later, by a young journalist who asked me if the world had learned from Chernobyl. I told him the truth. I said the world learned how to forget. How to rebuild without remembering. How to move on without understanding. When the interview was published, that line was missing. I was not surprised. Now, as I sit alone, listening to the quiet that has replaced the hum of machines and the voices of men long gone, I understand something I did not understand in 1986. The disaster did not end with the explosion. It ended slowly. In revisions. In omissions. In silence. It ended when the last person who remembered the truth stopped speaking. That is why I am speaking now. Not to accuse. Not to absolve. But to leave something behind that cannot be sealed under concrete. I was there. I watched a machine built by human hands outgrow human honesty. I watched fear become policy. I watched silence become safety. And I lived long enough to understand that survival is not the same as escape. If you are listening to this, then I am no longer alone with it. The reactor may be silent now, but the truth is not. I was there. I am the last witness.